Sisters and brothers, Chikwe, Dipo, Femi, Paddy, Nkem, Ike, Dylan, Ifeanyi, Chika, Nazo, Adogo, Felicia, Chooks, Ijeoma. That's the TEDx 2011 team. And in our tradition, to respect, you must first name. So let's demonstrate to them our respect. You know, sisters and brothers, we are invited by the TEDx team to redefine and to reimagine Africa. To redefine and to reimagine, you first have to be very clear about where you came from. And we need to be clear in Africa about where we came from. And as I grow older, I find that becomes even more important to me. It's one of the ironies, one of the many ironies of advancing age. And for me, it's important to remember that I am the grandson of a cocoa farmer from Achim and a printer from Hoxton. And it's about the Achim, about the Ghanaian side, that I want to reflect this morning, and to reflect about my grandfather in the context of redefining and reimagining the Africa of today and the Africa we want for the future. Because this cocoa farmer, who farmed a modest farm in the Achim region of what was then called the Gold Coast, managed to educate all his children from the proceeds of that farm, send one of them, my father, first to Fura Bay in Sierra Leone, and then to King's College here in London, and on to Gray's Inn to become a lawyer. Managed to do all of that from the proceeds of his cocoa farm. I myself was educated in Ghana with an education partly funded by a Cocoa Marketing Board scholarship. I would not be who I am and what I am, therefore, if it were not for my grandfather and for cocoa. And what helped my grandfather then? Well, a number of things. His cocoa was of the highest grade and commanded the highest prices, not simply because of his skill, but because he was the beneficiary of the best scientific research then available from the West African Cocoa Research Institute. And, you know, he was fortunate in one sense because his farm was directly adjacent to that institute. That was, of course, partly because the then colonial government stole my grandmother's farmlands and set up the institute in the first place on that land. I don't make that as a claim for reparation from the government I subsequently served in. But he was also the beneficiary of something else, a rail line that directly linked Achim to Takoradi, a rail line that no longer exists. The West African Cocoa Research Institute still exists, but in a diminished form as the Ghana Cocoa Research Institute. It was then itself the depository of world-class scientific research from a regionally integrated base. And that integration, that transport integration, enabled my grandfather to transport his cocoa directly and at a cheaper price, relatively, than it would cost today to transport the same amount of cocoa to Takoradi. And that's why no farmer of a medium-sized farm in Achim today can afford to educate their children from the proceeds of that farm alone. And so as we are redefining and reimagining Africa, we have to remember where we came from. We have to remember also that in redefining and reimagining Africa, we can only do so if we recognize the importance to Africa, to its development, of science, technology, innovation, and agriculture. And all too often, science, technology, and innovation are not the things you hear about when you hear about Africa. You hear about governance. They bang on and on about governance. I don't underestimate for one moment the importance of good governance. Funny though, isn't it, that when people talk about China, they don't bang on about governance. We have to think about that. So yes, good governance is very important. Poverty reduction, they bang on a lot about poverty reduction. I bang on a lot about poverty reduction, and rightly so. But you can't reduce poverty without growth. And you can't reduce poverty without creating wealth. And so as we redefine and reimagine Africa, I would suggest that we have to talk a little more about agriculture. We have to talk a little more about science, innovation, technology, and the importance of research and development. Doesn't mean we need to talk less about governance. We do. Because, you know, if there had been good governance, there would still be that rail line from Tafo in Achim to Takoradi. But governance, you know, not just of Ghana, but governance too of the IMF and the World Bank, who in the 70s and 80s and well into the 90s until the Africa Commission weren't talking. They weren't talking about infrastructure. Maybe that's because the IMF and the World Bank weren't so well governed. So let's talk about governance. But let's talk about governance in the whole. Let's talk about poverty reduction, but let's talk about poverty reduction within the context of creating wealth for the whole and seeing that wealth properly and fairly redistributed through effective taxation and governance. So I want to talk a bit, if I may, in my remaining 10 minutes about agriculture. Agriculture, the dominant economic sector in Africa, comprising some 30% of GDP and over 70% of employment. With the growing demand for food crops from emerging markets, agriculture has a significant added growth potential. We know that a $1 increase in agricultural value added generates a $1.3 to a $1.8 increase in the rural non-farm economy. Overall, GDP growth originating in agriculture is 2 to 4 times more effective in reducing poverty than growth generated outside agriculture. That's why the great Asian tigers were all inspired and rooted in their success post-war by the success of their agricultural economies. However, today in sub-Saharan Africa, cereal yields are on average only 44% of observed levels in South Asia and 25% of East Asia's. In addition to that, growth in yields is very slow. Now, these gaps are a problem, yes. But I would suggest that as we redefine and reimagine Africa, we need also to see them as an opportunity. Just as we need to see the fertilizer use in sub-Saharan Africa, which is again, extremely low, and the gap that exists there with farmers in Southeast Asia and Latin America using on average 143 kilograms per hectare, farmers in sub-Saharan Africa applying only 9.4 kilograms per hectare. So the growth numbers are low. And Africa lags behind the adoption and use of technology for farming. In 2008, there were about 15 tractors per square 100 kilometers of land in sub-Saharan Africa, while there were 183 per square kilometer, per square 100 kilometer of land in Southeast Asia. And again, when you look at data on irrigation, the best available figures suggest that only 4% of land in sub-Saharan Africa is irrigated compared to 40% in Southeast Asia. At current levels, yields are estimated at only 20% of potential in sub-Saharan Africa. Whilst, if you look at Southeast Asia and South America, 65%. So there is a huge potential for increasing yields in sub-Saharan Africa on currently cultivated areas. And if we could raise yields in Africa on key crops to 80% of the world average, similar to other countries which have experienced a green revolution in agriculture, that would see an increase in the annual value of its agricultural production by $235 billion over the next 2 decades, or more than 80% of the current revenues, according to the World Bank estimates. So improvements in African agriculture would have a huge impact on growth and job creation. So let's redefine and reimagine Africa through the spectacles of the rural farmer. And when we do that, let's not allow ourselves to be divided. Let's not allow ourselves to be divided between urban and rural, because we all know that there is, and rightly and understandably so, a huge increase in the demography of urban Africa. That's part of the excitement of this, the youngest demographically of continents. That's part of the excitement of Africa as a growing and emerging market for the rest of the world. But to counterpoise urban and rural in this way isn't helpful. We need to learn the lessons of what's already happening in the most progressive areas of our continent. One of the exciting things I think about Africa today is all the stuff that's going on, all the opportunities that are now coming to the fore. As you go in from Lagos Airport into Victoria Island, you'll see on the sides of the buses advertisements, exhortations around the exciting development of a rice project that is designed in Lagos State directly to provide employment opportunities for urban young people. And so linking enhanced rice production with employment opportunities for Lagos's youth. And it's delivering with massive increases in yields and at the same time addressing the issue of urban youth unemployment. So let's redefine and reimagine Africa. Let's do that in ways that respect agriculture, that respect also that you have to link agriculture with science, technology, and innovation. Let's celebrate the fact that as the African Union sets spending targets for African countries on agriculture, which sadly still only a handful, literally, only 5, have actually met those targets. That's a challenge for citizens and governments alike in sub-Saharan Africa, to spend what the AU itself has pledged ought to be spent on agriculture. But when we do that, let's spend it on enhancing those yields. Let's spend it in ways that see an increase in agricultural research and development. Let's see the example of the Ochihini's new University of Agriculture, Science and Technology in Kibi, in Achim, in Ghana. And you'll excuse me if I'm going on about Ghana, but I'm an Achim boy. I'm an Achim boy at heart. But that's an exciting innovation. Why it's so exciting? Because actually it stems not simply from government saying it's a good thing. Government has said it's a good thing. Not simply for the World Bank and the IMF and the donors saying it's a good thing. They have said it's a good thing, but actually none of them have given any money towards it. The money has come from the traditional ruler of the Achim area, from enlightened Ghanaian philanthropists, and from the private sector. And I would suggest that as we reimagine and redefine Africa, we need also to start reassessing the relationship between Africa, its own private entrepreneurial wealth creators, and the relationship too between citizens and their traditional leaders. Because in Africa, and to understand Africa, you cannot separate development from culture. You cannot separate development from culture. And for us in Africa, our traditional leadership, our ancestors are part of what we are, and part of where we are coming from. And so we have to develop progressive alliances that are rooted in African and indigenous culture, that are rooted too in a recognition that we can no longer continually look outside the continent for our salvation, that we need to look at intra-African trade as well as extra-African trade. We need to be building on the good work that is being done with the support of agencies like DFID actually, in creating one-stop border posts between African countries in order to promote intra-African trade. But that too requires an active engagement of citizens and government alike to make it happen. It requires new and exciting partnerships for change and progress. And partnerships too aren't things that can simply be left to other people. You know, partnerships are tough. It's a warm, soft, cuddly word that politicians and preachers are fond of. But for those of us who know anything about partnerships in any aspect of life, including our own lives, our own personal lives, partnerships have to be worked on. You know, yes, they're warm, soft, cuddly moments, but it requires honesty, it requires hard-headed calculation, and it requires strategy. So we need in Africa to move from sentiment to strategy. Sentiment is all very well, but without strategy, it is nothing. We need to be both fighters and builders. It's not a choice, you know. You don't choose whether you want to fight or whether you want to build. You do both. Because if you are an African, you recognize that if you don't fight as you build, what you build will be destroyed. I'm old-fashioned. That's a lesson I've learned from my life, that you constantly have to fight. Because there are those who constantly wish to destroy. And we have to be vigilant and bold and innovative and prepared to think outside the box. So I just urge and ask that we start thinking about science and technology and about agriculture, that we start thinking about linking the urban and the rural, that we start delivering on infrastructure with partners that involve governments, that involve the private sector, and that we do all of that with the spirit that demands of ourselves and our partners the best. You know, the late, great Dr. Agre used to say, only Agre of Africa, he used to say, only the best is good enough for Africa. Only the best is good enough for Africa. So let's demand of ourselves as individuals, of our fellow citizens, of our governments, of our partners internationally, of our donors, let's demand only the best, because only the best is good enough for Africa. And there is the saying too, a saying that, you know, I learned when I was in South Africa, but it's something that I think is true throughout the continent, because throughout the continent, when you look at our coats of arms time and time again, you find the African eagle demonstrated there and reflected there in our coats of arms. If you look at our great African skies, those clear, clear blue skies, it's the eagle that you see up there. And the saying is, and it's true, that it's each and every feather that makes the eagle soar. Each and every feather that makes the eagle soar. Because if you look at an eagle, you find this diversity in terms of shape and size and color and function. This diversity of feathers on that great bird. And it's the way the feathers interact with one another, with all their differences, with all their diversity, with all the different roles, that enables that great bird to take off, to take to the air, to spread out its wings and soar. So, let's have more of science, technology, innovation. Let's talk more. Let's do more. Let's build the practical partnerships on the ground that enable us to do yet more. Let's move from sentiment to strategy. And let that strategy embrace true partnerships based on mutual respect, not on dominance, not on the exercise of power relationships, but on the basis of mutual respect. And when we do that, and when we open up our minds and set those minds free of the constraints that others would seek to impose, when we do that, and we set of ourselves the task of only doing the best for Africa, because only the best is good enough for Africa. When we do that, sisters and brothers, the eagle will truly soar. So let the eagle soar. Let the eagle soar. Let the eagle soar. Let the eagle soar. Only the best is good enough for Africa. Thank you very much.